to Irish Roots. Today, I am going to be joined by Dame Elizabeth Annie Onwu. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hello, Grace. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited.
Thank you for the invite.
So, I guess we'll get right to the questions because that's why we're here to share your story and for us to learn some stuff from you. My first question for you is, how did your parents meet?
My parents met in 1947. Well, I say that actually. I was born in 1947. My parents met when they were at Cambridge University. They were both students. My mother was in her second year of classics degree when she became pregnant with me. And my father was just completing his law degree before going down to London to become a barrister. Now, my mother wasn't married, and she came from a loving but devoutly Roman Catholic family of Irish heritage. They were living in England, and my mother's pregnancy was just the biggest shock because she didn't get married to my father. And it caused huge stigma, shame, horror. But actually, unlike some of the very traumatic stories that we've heard, for example, Philomena is a very famous one. The Catholic Church were very supportive of my mother's family, my mother and my maternal grandparents, in the sense that they rallied round with the objective of my mother being able to go back to Cambridge University to complete her degree. And that I think, originally they thought that I would be adopted. But my mother's obstinacy and keen desire to keep me, she stopped attending the university. She dropped out of the university. And all she would tell my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, was that the father of the baby was a fellow student at Cambridge University. She didn't give them any other details, his name, nothing. So there was an assumption that I was going to be white. And so when my mother had me and my grandparents came to see me and my mom at the maternity home run by Irish Catholic nuns in the Midlands in England, the nun stopped my grandparents from coming in initially to say to them, to be sure, the baby's a little dark. And that was the first intimation that a little dark. And obviously it was when they looked at me. And, apparently I had afro hair from birth. And
oh my God.
You can see my skin color. It's never changed. And so what they all went through, goodness knows. I often wonder, what my mother must have been feeling, as maybe she could hear the footsteps of her parents approaching the room where it's all going to be revealed. So it was a huge shock to everybody. So my grandparents, before my birth, had said, my grandmother had said, what we'll do is we'll pretend that it's my baby, that I've had a late, baby and unexpected baby pregnancy suddenly, and we'll tell the neighbors that it's our child.
Yeah.
But of course, when they saw my skin color, plan A, as it was, went out of the window.
Yeah.
And the reason I know so much about the reactions was that when I came to write my memoirs, I know we'll talk about that later,
Hmm.
I didn't have any photographs of myself, or very few photographs of myself as a child. I just actually had one, me sitting on my mom's knee when she came to visit me. We were outside the children's home. I was only about, I'm not sure, about maybe 10 months, 11 months, 12 months. I don't know. And I wanted to see if the children's home that I grew up in until I was 9, Nazareth House Children's Home in Birmingham, whether they had any records, any photographs of me. And it was when I contacted them, they said, "Oh, no, we don't have any photographs of you." And I was really upset. But they said, "But we have a dossier of correspondence and notes about you from the time that your grandparents contacted us to when you left the children's home aged 9. Would you be interested in them?" Would I be interested in them?
Of
Without any
course.
without any difficulty, I obtained those records, and in fact saw a social worker called an origin social worker. So this is very unlike the situation I know many of my Irish mixed race friends have experienced in their attempts to get records. I know things
Mm-hmm.
hopefully are changing or have changed, but it was so easy for me in England. Didn't I got all these records, and that's how I know the circumstances surrounding my mother finding out she was pregnant, me, why I was placed temporarily in a children's home. My mother wanted to become a journalist. She didn't in the end, but she stayed with her parents until she got married to an English guy. Uh, but I had all these records of my experience in the children, well, some of the experience in the children's home, and that's helped me enormously understand what
Yeah. Now
what
you said, sorry to interrupt you. You
no.
said that you stayed temporarily in the children's home. Can you expand a little bit about that?
Well, I think my poor mother hoped that it would not be longer than a year or so, but it was very difficult for her to sort herself out because she always wanted to try and make a home for me, and it
Okay.
took until I was 9 for her to take me out of the children's home to live with her and my stepfather. We can talk later why it didn't work out, but that was my mom's plans. But I lived in Nazareth House Children's Home, Catholic convent, for 9 years.
Wow.
So I can talk about that if you like, that
Yeah,
experience.
absolutely. Tell us about 9 years in Nazareth Children's Home.
Yeah, because actually, on the whole, Grace, I have pleasant experiences. Don't worry, there were some negative experiences, I can tell you.
Yeah.
But I think first and foremost, I never had any sense of rejection from my mother because she was a constant visitor.
Okay.
In fact, I've even, in those records I got from Nazareth House, is a list of all the dates. Can you believe it? All the dates that she came to visit me.
Oh.
Because they had to have a visiting card, they couldn't just turn up. But that really reinforces this issue that I never experienced any rejection from my mother. And I think that's what every child wants, to feel
Yeah.
acceptance, isn't it? And it also shows how courageous and independent and obstinate my mother was in that era, in the late 1940s, to have a mixed race child, a brown skinned baby. We all know some of the issues and the traumas. But anyway, I I lived, let's say, for 9 years, and it was run by Irish nuns, as I've said, and that's where one of my most joyful experiences were, Grace, was Irish
Seriously.
dancing. Now, Grace, I won medals doing Irish dancing in the children's home.
Oh my
And
God.
so, I have wonderful memories of, there was a little troop of us. There was only I don't know how many, I think maybe it was a half a dozen in the dance troupe. I can't remember. It wasn't a huge number. And I, I, I've since met up with somebody who knew me as a child in the convent. She wasn't in the convent herself, but she came to the school. So she was a local resident who came to the Catholic school run by Nazareth House nuns. And she, of Irish heritage herself, white Irish heritage. And she said that the Irish dance classes used to be on a Saturday morning. I mean, she's got a much better memory than I have. She's a few years younger than me, but I can't remember details like that. All I can remember is thoroughly enjoying Irish dancing. And I do remember, though, one day, probably at the weekend, our group, our Irish dance group, went to Stoke-on-Trent, which is not that far away from Birmingham, where the convent was, to take part in a competition. And I won medals there. And I remember there were some men, very friendly men. I presume they were Irish men, Irish heritage men, who one of them came up to me, was so impressed with. I mean, I must have been a real sight to see this brown-skinned child doing Irish dancing in the 1950s in the Midlands in England. And I remember he pressed a half a crown. Of course, we don't have half crowns now, but he pressed half a crown into my hand, saying what a wonderful dancer I was, and I was so proud. But then I was really annoyed because the nun took the half crown off me, and I never saw that. Having said that, so I have got memories like that, and it's why Irish dance music is still so joyous to me today.
I mean,
and
what a beautiful
I
memory.
love to watch Irish dancing. I really do. So those were very pleasant memories. And I have other pleasant memories, but there was the worst memory in my experience in the children's home were for children like myself who wet the bed, because the punishment was so harsh. What they would do would be we'd have to stand on a small chair, and then the nun would drape our urine-soaked sheet over our body. That wasn't all the punishment. We then had to raise our arms out straight. And the punishment was you had to keep your arms stretched out until the nun told you put them down. But of course, it's very, very painful to keep your arms up. And your arms would go down, and there would be a nun on the other side of the sheet who just whack you with some sort of stick or ruler to tell you to get your arms back up. And I was really quite a young child when that started happening. And even then I thought, this is so cruel, and you're supposed to be religious, and we're all going to church goodness knows how many times on a Sunday and other festivals, and we're supposed to be kind and Christian to each other. And I knew this was wrong. I knew as a small child this was wrong, but I also had learned, there's certain things you don't challenge because you get into more trouble. So there were harsh aspects to life, but as I said, overall, I could tell you other things, but those are, I think I've given you the example of my best memory. I think there were others. Also, I was taught with just a few other kids to play the piano when I was in the Nazareth House Convent. I think they saw something in me, Grace. I don't know, because I do love music. And if we had done our piano exercises correctly, the nun would take us into Birmingham city centre. And I remember there was only a couple of us that were taken with this nun, and we would be treated to Knickerbocker glories. Now, do you know what Knickerbocker glories are?
I do, because I used to read a book when I was little called Paddington Bear, I think, and there was some part of it where he went to get a Knickerbocker glory. Wow. And all my life, all I ever wanted was to get a Knickerbocker glory. Well, so this is great.
So, Grace, I can tell you, Knickerbocker glories, certainly in my youth, were absolutely delicious. I mean, basically, it's a big, for a child, it's a big glass cup or whatever, and there's ice cream, and I think there's a biscuit at the top, and you have this long spoon to sort of dig out the ice cream and eat it. Absolutely scrumptious, I can't tell you. So you see, there were some kind nuns, there were, but there were some horrible nuns. I mean, I have allergies like anything, house dust mite and all sorts of things. And we used to have to do cleaning as part of our domestic duties, I don't know. And part of it was not polishing, but dusting or sweeping. And my eyes just used to water, my nose used to run, because they didn't know that I had an allergy then, but I definitely had this allergy. And I'd be wheezing. I mean, I eventually was diagnosed with asthma at the age of 11.
Oh, wow.
And so one of the nuns would be telling me off because I think she thought I was trying to get out of doing these, household duties. But another nun took pity on me and said, and took me to this Mother Superior. And I think they must have realized, I think this other nun realized it was always happening to me, that I wasn't trying to be awkward. So the Mother Superior deemed that I should do another duty, which was polishing, and I didn't get allergic reactions doing that. So there was that. And then another negative story I can tell you, and this was all to do with, this one was particularly to do with my race, was that one of the nuns was putting on a little drama event show for the other children, and chose a few of us. The theme was nursery rhyme characters, and she chose me to be Humpty Dumpty. And I was so thrilled, obviously a bit of a show off, I was so thrilled to be chosen. But another nun started arguing with her, saying I couldn't be Humpty Dumpty because I was half caste, because this was the term that was used in those days. And I remember watching these two nuns arguing about me. So part of me was very impressed that I was the subject of the argument, but I was sobbing my heart out because I wanted to be Humpty Dumpty. Well, my tears dried up when the good nun won the argument, and I was Humpty Dumpty, and I did fall off that wall with such elan, I tell you. But the other story I'm going to tell you, which would indicate that I was becoming more and more aware of being the only Black child in that children's home until just before I left at the age of 9. And this was that I washed my face 10 times with quite rough red Lifebuoy soap of some type, to try and become white. Now, a child isn't logical, because when I look back, people could see my hands, and if it was summer, in fact, I always used to insist on wearing a cardigan, even if it was very hot, because I didn't want people to see my brown arms. But actually, of course, they could see my hands, but I was trying to hide as much as I could. And of course, they could see my face. And so I tried to wash my face to make it become white like my friends. Now, because I've got sensitive skin, I have eczema. I had very bad eczema as a child. I ended up in sick bay. Now, I'm going to finish with one final story, I think, from children's home, because it was this event that made me want to become a nurse. I know we'll come to my career later, but let me explain this one. It was the fact that I did have very bad eczema in my arms, in the armpits and behind my knees. And it would bleed, it was painful. So I used to have to go to the sort of sick bay regularly, and they would apply this, it was called coal tar paste, beautifully cooling. And then they'd bandage it, the nun would bandage it round. And then I'd have to go for another, for a change of dressing, I don't know how often during the week. Now, I would always peep around the sick bay room to see whether what I, in my mind, called the white nun or the black nun was there. Now, they were all white. All the nuns were white, predominantly Irish nuns, as I've said. But most of the nuns wore the traditional black habit, nun's habit. But there was one nun who wore the white habit, and she was the one that I wanted to change my dressings, because she would use humor to distract me. And what
Okay.
she would do would be to use words like bottom. Well, I thought that was really rude because, again, we were just immersed in the Catholic faith. I can tell you,
Mm,
swearing was out of it. We went to confession. You can imagine. So to hear
yeah.
this nun use a word like bottom, which I thought was so rude, I would burst out laughing. And while I was laughing, she would take the bandage off and the dressing, and I wouldn't
Mm,
feel a thing. Whereas the other
yeah.
nuns would just tear the dressing off, and they would cause my skin to bleed and come off. It was all horrible. So I thought this nun was the most wonderful woman on earth, I can tell you. And later
Mm,
on, before I left, I discovered she was something called a nurse as well. And that's
okay.
why I vowed to be a nurse and never swayed from that at all.
And use words like bottom when treating your patients.
Can you imagine? Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so when you were 9, you left the home
Yes,
in Nazareth.
yes.
And where did you go and what happened and what was it this part of your life like?
Okay, so as I said, my mother had always wanted to make a home for me. And at the age of 9, she'd now been married to this English chap for, I think, about 2 to 3 years. And so by this time, I had a half brother, and
Mhm.
another brother was on the way. So my mother took me to her home, which was a council house in Wolverhampton. And
Mm,
there I met my stepfather and my little toddler brother. And to start with, everything was fine. Obviously, my mum made a fuss of me and my stepfather initially was fine with me. But gradually, I don't know when it started, but he started to physically abuse me when my mum wasn't around. And I never told my mother. I mean, the sort of things he would do would be to tell me off when I was trying to dry the glasses. And he said, the glasses are not, they have to be shiny. Now, I know I'm intelligent. I didn't realize I was intelligent as a child. You don't know that. But
mm,
I started to try and use my logic with my stepfather, which wasn't a very good idea, because I would
mm,
try and explain to him, the glasses will never be like that because the tea cloth is damp. I mean, I understood that as a child.
mm.
And he just took the tea cloth away from me and literally whipped me with it. And it's like a whiplash. Oi. And I still
Oh,
can remember that. And it was so painful, but that wasn't the worst. And again, I never told my mother. And he would also started to treat me differently. And he would get ice cream for my brother, but he wouldn't get one for me. Really
mm,
cruel for a child.
yeah.
And again, my mother wasn't aware of this. Anyway, one day, I don't know why, my little half brother was sweet little thing, but I kicked him. His siblings. We had a
Yeah.
fight. Must have annoyed me about something. And you never know, it could have been something to do with what was happening with me and my stepfather. But anyway,
Mhm.
I kicked my half brother, my brother. We call him my brother.
Yeah.
And my mother told my stepfather about this. She rued the day that I'm pretty sure she didn't never told me this, but because I'd gone to sleep, he liked to drink, by the way. And
Yeah.
so my mom must have told him that evening. And he came, I sort of heard him coming up the stairs towards the top of the stairs. I heard this sort of thumping, and he dragged me down the stairs and just slapped me. And I just went right across this small front room and hit, it's actually my left eyebrow on the hearth, which is like stone. And it
Mm,
split open and bled, and it was painful, and I must have been screaming. Now, that's all I remember. It was very traumatic.
mm,
All I know, it wasn't that long. I don't know how long after that. My mother must have contacted my grandparents, who by now had
mm,
moved to the north west of England near Liverpool. And my grandfather came to collect me, and I went to stay for my teenage years with my grandparents. And so that was the end of me for at that point anyway, staying with my mother and stepfather. Oh, apparently my stepfather had been teased um, at the pub or at work. I don't know. What's he doing allowing his woman to have a half-caste child in the house? Again, we're talking about now the mid-1950s.
Mm.
It was still very rare to see black children, actually, in neighborhoods where I lived anyway.
Mm. I mean, I don't know about everyone else who's watching, but that I'm just honestly blown away by that. And
Mm.
yeah, a little bit speechless.
You see, I think people ask me how come I've achieved so much, and I know I have. I think
Yeah.
what I use the term rescued sometimes. I have been rescued every so often,
Yeah.
and it's made me. So, for example, my grandparents, and it's made me aware quite early, even like the nuns that were arguing and one coming to my rescue.
Yeah.
It's made me realize that there are good people as well as quite horrible people, and
Yeah.
I think that's given me hope, because and I think also that maybe there's something about my own personality, but there's something about other people's personality. There will, people can be kind, people can have the courage to step in and rescue, if you
Yeah.
like, a rescue,
I mean,
because so that's what my grandparents did, and my grandfather. So it's my grandparents that I still linked in with the Irish perspective, if you like, because I had it
mhm,
as I had it in the children's home until I was 9.
mhm,
Not really when I lived with my mother and my stepfather,
mm,
but that was about 20 months. But then when I was nearly 11. So from nearly 11 to 16, I stayed with my grandparents. My grandfather died after just under 2 years. He died of a heart attack. But they now we're getting nearer to, it was their parents that were the Irish
yeah.
migrants, you see. So
Yeah.
for that teenage period, I listened to Irish music, John McCormack. My grandmother used to wait on tenterhooks just before St. Patrick's Day,
Oh,
worried that the shamrock wasn't going to arrive from Ireland, because my grandmother, I'll talk a little bit about my grandparents. They were
yeah.
both born in 1896 in Liverpool.
Oh, wow.
Both their parents had come over from Ireland. So, so the fact that I was getting closer to that generation who had
Mhm.
this big Irish cultural influence, just brought me back to the convent days, if you like. My grandfather had fought in the First World War with the Irish Connaught Regiment. My my great aunt, one of my great aunts, I discovered, who I was very close to. She lived in Liverpool with my another great aunt, Lil. But great aunt Kate was a radical, my dear. She'd been in Cumnaban. I'm not going to pronounce this properly, I'm afraid, but Cumnaban, the Irish women's.
Come on. Yeah.
Oh, okay. She was a member of that. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yes. So I didn't know
They were
that.
very cool. They were like bad awesomeness, you
Yeah.
know?
So
Yeah.
she never told me that. I learned that from my aunt, my mom's sister.
Mm,
But my grandfather discovered I liked history and that I loved Irish music, and he he heard me listening to The Wearing of the Green,
mm,
and he explained on one of our walks, that the history of that song about the English banning the Irish from wearing their shamrock, you know. And so he did tell me about Irish history. So again, as you see, it sort of brought me close. As I said, that teenage period, because I was living with my grandparents, and I met I stayed, had holidays with my great aunt Kate and great aunt Lil in Liverpool, and so, as I've said, that really reinforced some aspects of Irish heritage for me, which
Yeah, I
was
think it's wonderful that you were able to maintain that connection, that
mm,
although you went through a lot at the
mm,
beginning of your life, you
mm,
still were able to immerse yourself in Irish culture.
mm,
At that
mm,
time, I mean, it's so great, like, and it's great to hear that as
mm.
a 33-year-old Irish woman. It's wonderful to hear that you were able to have that experience and to
Mm.
feel that
Because
connection to Ireland.
sorry, because at this point anyway, I didn't know who my father was, and I knew not to ask, because
Mhm.
children know when, if somebody doesn't talk about something, you don't ask. And I had
Yeah.
my mother's maiden name, because although she's married now, but she had me when she was single, and it's an
Mhm.
Irish surname. So you know, and people just assumed I'd been adopted. They couldn't understand how I had an Irish surname, and I would
Yeah.
have classic question. You all know what it is. Where, I mean, people would ask me very kindly. It wasn't necessarily negative. Sometimes it was. On the whole, it wasn't. It was curiosity. Where are you from, my dear? And I would say Birmingham, because this was when I lived in the Midlands, and I was born in Birmingham, England.
Yeah.
And no, 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 no. And I always remember this woman waving her hand in front. No, 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 no. Where are you really from?
I can't
Birmingham.
believe that question is
And
still
and
going
and
on to this
well,
day. Like,
this was when I was young, and I know it occasionally happens still, doesn't it? Well, I think it's still, but
mm,
I would have been, this is when I was young, and when I was a teenager, I was being asked it. But I don't know. I just remember this lady. I don't know how old I was, bending down over me. Very nice to start with, and she was. I can't say she was cruel afterwards, but when she first asked was, "Oh, hello, my dear, where are you from?" And obviously, it took me ages to realize that they're curious about my skin color. Because as I said,
mhm,
it was so rare. It was so rare.
mhm.
And then I'd come out with this brummy, black country accent.
Yeah.
where is where is this child from? But with an Irish surname. So I would say Birmingham. No, no, no. Where are you really from? So gradually, I would have to say, oh, when I knew about my father, because I didn't know at this point, gradually I ended up saying I'm half Irish, half Nigerian, born in England, and that I knew that would
Yeah.
address whichever bit of they were interested in, Yeah.
Let me just answer all of the possible things
Yes.
that you mean by that
Yeah.
question.
Take your pick. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So just not to cut across you, but I wanted to get to your career.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that started when I'm assuming you turned 18. Can you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about your career and the work that you've
Yes.
done?
Yes, certainly. Well, I kept to my wish to become a nurse. So 18, I came down to London, and I qualified after 3 years for what was called state registered nurse. It's called registered nurse now. And then I tried to do. I worked for 6 months as a staff nurse. Then I went up to Edinburgh to do midwifery, as we called it, to do midwifery. But I only lasted 5 months up there, because I experienced horrible bullying by a ward sister, really horrible bullying. And so much so that I got depressed a bit. And I happened to be walking down the corridor of this maternity hospital, and the matron stopped me. I'd forgotten she was the matron, but they always come and see you when you first arrive and give you the pep talk and that. And we were, there was 12 of us in the cohort, I think 12, 14, and we were quite diverse. I wasn't the only black student. And, but she stopped me and said, you are Elizabeth. I think she even knew my name. I can't remember, but she did stop me and said, "What's the matter with you? You don't look as cheerful as you used to look. I thought, who's this? She introduced herself as the matron. I burst into tears. Because I was so depressed about the way this sister had been treating me. So this matron of the whole hospital, my goodness, took me to her office, made me tea, and got me to tell her what had happened. And she reassured me. She said, "You did nothing wrong." I told her the background to why the sister had been treating me like this. She said, "You did nothing wrong. You're perfectly right." She said, I will talk to that sister." She said, "Now, do you actually want to not qualify? She said, do you want to actually practice as a midwife?" I said, "No, actually, So she said, "Well, look," she said, "what do you want to do?" So I discovered health visiting by then. This career called health visiting, where you visit people in their own homes. So I said, I'd love to be a health visitor. So she said, "Well, look, I will give you a reference when you apply to do the health visiting course." But she said, "That's still 9 months. What do you want to do in the meantime?" So I said, "Actually, I'd like to go and work in Paris, in France, because I've always loved speaking French, but I wanted to improve my spoken French." So she said, "Well, look, you let me know when you get a job, and good luck." So again, this was something, this rescuing, if you like, and having fun.
Yeah.
And so I did. I applied and I got a job, and I went to work I didn't actually work in a midwifery clinic because I wasn't qualified as a midwife, but I worked it was a private maternity clinic, and I went to teach the two children's of the owners there was an obstetrician, there was a married couple. The father was the consultant obstetrician and the mother was the consultant neonatologist, newborn babies. And they lived above the shop, so to speak, above the clinic. And they had two young children, 9 and 11, I think. And they wanted me to just to speak English to the children. It was quite a family. So I lived in Paris for 9 months. Absolutely adored it. I was treated so well. But it was in Paris where I met a midwife who worked at this clinic. And she was from Benin, the then French colony of Benin. And she was very political. We got on so well. She was very curious about me and whether I'd read any Black authors. I said no. But before that, I told her this story about washing my face 10 times as a child, children's home, and she said, had I read Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks? Then she found out she said, well, she knew I read a lot. She said, have you read any Black authors? We weren't introduced to any Black authors in school. So that's when she suggested Frantz Fanon and this particular book. He had noticed that many Black and brown-skinned individuals didn't like the color of their skin and wanted to be white, basically. And that for some, it affected their mental state, this issue of identity. And when I read the book, eventually I got through a bit of the theoretical stuff. I started to really understand what he was talking about. And it really explained to me why I felt uncomfortable sometimes in my brown skin, because it was seen in such a negative way, etc., etc. And of course, I didn't know my father at this point either. So that really, I always wanted to find out more about my father, but that spurred me on. When I came back, it would have been 1970, I think I came back, but I didn't write to my mom and ask about my dad until 1972. So, you do sit on these issues, don't you, for thinking,
absolutely.
I know I want to find out, but I'll do it in my own time, sort of thing,
You have to you have to get it to the right spot in your brain, right? Where you feel comfortable enough that you're ready to have the information and you're ready to ask for the information.
That's right. Yeah. So I'll come back to my father. I'm sure you'd like to know about that.
Yeah.
But just to finish with a bit about my career, I did practice as a health visitor for 3 years in Brent, northwest London, and it was there that I first came across a family who had a young boy with sickle cell anemia. And I remember the mother quite reasonably happy about the care of her child, but wanting to know lots more about the illness and asking me. And I couldn't answer her because I'd never been taught about sickle cell anemia in my nursing course, in what bit of midwifery I'd done, and neither in my health visiting course. And I'd done my health visiting course in the early 1970s, in London. And nobody had ever mentioned sickle cell in any of these courses. So part of me was embarrassed and frustrated that I couldn't help the mother, but also I was really angry. And it was later on when I read President Obama's first memoirs, Dreams from My Father, that he talks about having this sort of having this anger deep down in his belly. And I realized, something? I'm holding on to a lot of anger deep, deep, deep. I've never been to a psychiatrist or anything, but I realize now that we we store anger. But, this anger helped me enormously because often anger is in a very negative way, and anger can be negative, and it can harm you mentally and physically. But anger can be used in a positive way because anger creates energy, and in my simplistic view, you can either use that anger in a negative way or in a positive way. And I
Exactly.
now, looking back, I realized, thank goodness, I use my anger on the whole in a very positive way. It sort of drove me into finding more out about these issues of inequalities, of health inequalities, etc., etc. And sickle cell was one, but I didn't do it straight away. Again, I sat on this for quite some time. It was after I knew my father, I met my father, and I discovered I had a cousin with sickle cell anemia. This is my Nigerian family. And again, reflecting, looking back, I realized 3 P's have influenced me. P's, the letter P. And I talk about personal, professional, and political. And in different ways, they've influenced, for example, why I ended up getting involved with sickle cell anemia. So professional, coming across families who felt that they would have liked more information. Personal, after I met my dad, finding sickle cell was actually in my family. I wasn't affected, but I had cousins. And then political. By the time I came back from France, I was a political animal with a small p. I joined the Labour Party for a few years. I linked up with one of the first, I think it was the second Black publishing house to be established in Britain. It was called Bogle Overture Publications, run by Jessica and Eric Huntley in West London, and I volunteered that because, to say, I'm an avid reader, and my friend in France had alerted me, hey, there's a whole wealth of literature by Black, writers. So these are some of the influences in the early 70s, even before I met my dad. Because I found my dad in 1972, so it's around this time. But even just before that, I knew in fact, I went to America through the Labour Party. The Fabians organized a very cheap trip in 1971 in collaboration with the Americans for Democratic Action. I went on that trip with a small group. There was only about I was the only Black British person on that trip. We went to New York, we went to Philadelphia, we went to Washington, D.C. When I was in New York, I met Bayard, the now late Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin, he was the person who organized the 1963 March on Washington. I kid you not. And he called me over. He gave his seminar, whatever he gave, about civil rights. It was fascinating. And I remember one of the women, the white British women, I just wanted a hole to open up. because she put her hand up and said, "Oh, it's terrible to hear about all that you've gone through in this country." She said, "We're so lucky we haven't had these problems in Britain." Huh? And I must have gone, "Oh." But
Okay.
fired, fired Rustin like a flash. And he had this very eloquent way of speaking, quite slow, measured, but firm. And all he said, "Didn't you all have something called the Notting Hill riots?" It was like he was teaching British history. It was just
Absolutely.
I don't
Oh
know how I was.
God.
But I have to remember now, this was 1970, that was 1971. By this time now, I had my hair in a huge black afro. Now, my hair is grey, salt and pepper, but in those days it was black, 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 and it was out here. I got a note from his assistant to come over and say hello to him. Oh God. I went over and he said, "I'm just curious, what's your role with the group?" And I said, "I'm part of the group." He said, "Oh, you're English." And he just burst out laughing. He thought I was African American, because a lot of people did,
Mm.
until I opened my mouth. And so to cut a long story short, he asked if I would like to see, when I went particularly to Washington, D.C., would I like to see more of the Black experience,
Mhm.
when I was there. I said, "You bet." So he gave me a number. In fact, he spoke to somebody in Washington, D.C. there and then, and he rang this person. So when I got to Washington, D.C., this guy organized for me to see all sorts of things in Washington, D.C. Can you imagine? Oh, unbelievable. That was the beginning of my civil rights education, US. Oh, it was beautiful. It was wonderful. So anyway, that I was just trying to explain my influences that were happening, even
Mhm.
as a health visitor. And it was also, I think, also propelled me to come on and find my dad. But before we get to that, so I became a health visitor. I did a tutor's course, because actually I'd met my dad by this time and I wanted to go to Nigeria. We'll talk about Nigeria and that, if you like, later. But that I worked as a community nurse tutor in Brent. I changed my mind about going to live in Nigeria, but I was visiting Nigeria a lot. And then I became the first sickle cell nurse specialist in 1979. Sickle cell, I call it sickle cell nurse counselor, because I was really, I was providing, I was based in the community, but as part of the hematology department of the hospital.
Mhm.
And I was providing information, genetic counseling, which when one of my trips to the United States, the Sickle Cell Foundation of the United States got me onto a sickle cell course in
Oh, great.
San Francisco for free. Oh, I tell you, that's why people are so helpful. And so I was this ran the Brent sickle and thalassemia. That's another inherited condition. I ran that for nearly 10 years before I went into academic life, going to the Institute of Child Health in London, retaining my specialty in multi-ethnic issues in health.
Mm.
Obviously, sickle cell was a particular area. And I was there for 7 years. And then my final tranche before I retired was was at the University of West London, where I was made a professor of nursing. And I ran the Mary Seacole Centre I set up and ran the Mary Seacole Centre for Nursing Practice, where I was able to teach, write, research into multi-ethnic areas of health, particularly nursing and midwifery issues. So I retired when I was 60, because I was quite tired by then. I'd started work at 16, and I kept quite busy after that, but
Yeah.
that's in a nutshell some aspects of my career.
Yeah. So there is not much known in Ireland about sickle cell. Can you tell us why it's important for us to know? And also, can you direct us to where we might be able to get the information?
Yes, certainly. So sickle cell anemia is one of several types of sickle cell disease or sickle cell disorders. So I'm going to talk about sickle cell anemia because it is the commonest one, and it's an inherited condition. In other words, a child born with this illness has to have inherited the sickle gene from both parents. So but those parents are usually silent, healthy carriers of something called, for example, sickle cell trait, and they wouldn't know that they have this until they had a special blood test, which is very cheap to have. So, if a child is born with sickle cell anemia, they're fine for the first few months of their life, and then they are vulnerable to developing what's called a painful crisis, because what happens is the red blood cells change to a sickle-shaped cell, which is like the farmer's sickle, banana, half-moon shape. But they're also, these red cells become sticky, sort of a bit tough, and they can clog the blood vessels, and that causes mild to absolutely excruciating episodes of pain. That's the painful crisis. The condition is variable within the individual. It's variable in its severity and the frequency that the problems can occur. Some people can go for years without problems, and some people are totally some nearly incapacitated with it, can have disabilities such as strokes, shoulder, hip problems, lung problems. It even can affect the eyes because it's to do with the circulation. So it's a condition that originated in parts of the world where you find a type of malaria. And as a result of that, it's more commonly found in people of African, South Asian, Middle East, Mediterranean, Middle East origins. So in this country, in the UK, the majority of patients with the illness happen to be black and skinned because they're of Caribbean, African, or Middle East, etc. heritage. Now, it's nothing to do with skin color. You know, one of the myths is that you have to be black to have sickle cell, and the blacker you are, I've heard, the worse it gets. That's totally untrue. There are blue-eyed, white, blonde-haired individuals with sickle cell anemia, particularly in countries like Greece and Italy. As I said, it's where this malaria is prevalent.
Okay.
This malaria is found in the Mediterranean areas. However, in this country, it is rare to find white people with the condition. It's not that rare to find them with the trait. They're usually unaffected with the trait. The trait does not change into the illness. However, it has.
But if a white person with the trait has a child with, say, a black person also with the trait, there's a chance that that child could have it.
That's right. And also, when we talk about mixed-raced individuals like ourselves, we could have inherited the sickle from one of our parents, and that means we have the chance of passing that sickle gene, not the illness, because it's got. But can you imagine? There are white people who don't actually have a clue about where their ancestry is, or people who appear white. You know, how many people really know? Going back
where they came from. Because I'll
so
tell you, I have a 3-year-old and he is blonde hair and blue-eyed and could totally pass for 100% white. So I'm sure they're,
in England, in the NHS newborn screening program, every baby is screened. I mean, the screening is offered, put it that way, alongside the screening for phenylketonuria, the PKU, etc. The baby has a heel prick done at about 6-7 days of age, and part of the tests, one of the things they're screening for is sickle cell anemia.
Okay,
And so that was a major achievement to get what is called universal screening for sickle cell for the newborns, regardless of ethnic origin, because the
Okay.
evidence was there that you will miss babies if the poor midwife is expected to ascertain, is this an at-risk baby by the look or what the parents tell them
Yeah.
or whatever, you're going to miss some babies. So that so all babies regard, so that I think shows you there's been some progress in the
Mhm.
understanding and getting away from some of the myths.
Yeah, that's awesome. And can you tell us where we can travel to try and find out more information about sickle cell?
Yes, certainly. I am a patron of this national charity for sickle cell society, the Sickle Cell Society in this country. So sicklecellsociety.org. So www.sicklecellsociety. So that's sicklecellsociety.org. It's an excellent charity. But first and foremost, if people go onto that site, they will see videos, literature, blogs for the lay person, for the health
Mhm.
professional, for the profession, whatever level you feel, however deep you want to go into this issue, there's resources freely
Mhm.
available on the Sickle Cell Society website. So I would urge anybody that's interested to log on to that site.
Amazing. Awesome. We're running up to time, so let's talk about, we have a couple more things that we want to talk about, so let's just talk about them. The first thing that we wanted to talk about was about your dad and how you
Mhm.
found him and what that experience was like.
So very briefly then, I was, as I've said, a health visitor. It was 1972. I was 25, coming up to 25. And I at last wrote to my mom, who was still living in the Midlands, tell me about my dad. And she wrote back straight away, told me that his full name,
Mm,
Lawrence Victor Odiatu Anion, and that he was back in Nigeria. They had lost contact quite a few years before they had been in contact. She knew he was married, and that she thought that it'd be very difficult for me to find him. She wasn't sure it was a good idea for me to look for him because she was I think she was worried that I might get rejection from his family.
mhm,
I didn't do anything with the name for 3 months. I put it at the back of my diary, little diary that I carried with me. I didn't know any Nigerians. But then I was friendly with a Sierra Leonean, he's deceased now, Sierra Leonean barrister, who happened to tell me one day that he taught occasionally Nigerian law students. I thought, oh, okay. So I said, do you think you could find out what part of Nigeria my dad's name comes from? Because I knew there were
mm,
different ethnic groups in Nigeria. And that was on a Monday evening in June 1972. I think it was it was Wednesday morning. John rang me at my clinic, health visiting clinic, said, I've spoken to your dad. I
you
said,
signed
what?
that?
I said, what, in Nigeria? He said, no, he's living in Palmer's Green, North London at the moment. He lives in Nigeria normally, but this was a few years, not that long after the Nigerian Civil War, the Biafran War.
Mm,
And he had a house in London, and he was sort of recuperating a bit. So John said, look, this is his number, and he wants you to ring him. So I dropped the phone on John, and in a state of shock, I thankfully picked the phone up, spoke to my father, and I met my father the next day in London.
oh my
And it was
goodness.
only a few months later that he went back to live permanently in Nigeria. So all sorts of good luck came my way. I went to see him,
Mm,
and we got on so well, Grace. First of all, we looked like each other. And in fact, when I used to
mm,
go to Nigeria or see Nigerian family in London, but particularly in Nigeria, they'd call me Little Lawrence because his first name
mm,
was Lawrence. we found we had the same taste in music, in literature. And then he told me all about his career. He'd become an ambassador. He practiced law when he went back to Nigeria. He had become a civil servant, and then he'd become Nigeria's first ambassador to Italy and the Vatican. He had a couple of children. I met my half brother because he was only a teenager in London, in England at school. So I met him. He's now deceased. And I've only recently, literally this year, met my half sister. Isn't that wonderful? Because she lives in Italy.
Yeah.
Life is wonderful, you know. You have to be very, very patient, though. Anyway, I only knew my father for 8 years, sadly, because he died quite young. And but they were wonderful 8 years and sorted me out completely in terms of my identity, because now I knew my whole, parentage. And my mother was really shocked that I found him so quickly, but very pleased. It all worked out very well.
Yeah.
So I've got a really uplifting story as to how it can work out, because I know it doesn't necessarily work out for everybody. They don't necessarily find them, and if they do find the biological parents, it doesn't necessarily work.
But I think as well, there's such a rhetoric that goes around that like it never works out and there are no goods. That's kind of what we all. I don't want to say we all, but like it's kind of in the back of our mind because there are so many that don't work out that it's just so wonderful and lovely to hear a story where it did work out. And although there were hard times, there were good times too. And the lessons that you learned throughout your life about, good people and bad people and how to channel anger. And I mean, you've just had an extraordinary life.
Sorry, halfway through knowing my father, I decided to take his surname. And I just decided, people ask me, well, why? Come on, I decided I was going to take, and my mom was happy with it.
Can you tell me about your memoirs?
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. So first of all, I self-published my memoirs towards the end of 2016, and they did very well, actually. But late last year, I was approached by a publisher, and so it's coming out in September with a new title. It's called Dreams from My Mother. And I can't tell you how delighted I am with this, because it's updated, so it'll include getting the damehood, etc. But that's not really that important. But it brings it to it really rounds off, I'm going to say, the downs and ups of my life, because on the whole it's up at now. And so it covers up to, well, early this year, 2020. So yeah, I'm so excited. And it will be an audio book as well, which I didn't do with my self-published. So I've still to record that. But, and it'll be internationally available. Yeah.
So this September, watch out for Dreams from My Mother.
Yes.
Okay, we're about to tune out, but before we do, I have one more thing that I wanted to ask you, and that is, how do you identify?
So I do describe myself as mixed race, and the reason I use that term is that race straight away tells you about skin color, as far as I'm concerned, because you could be dual heritage and you could be white, Scottish, Irish. I'm very proud of the fact that I'm Irish, Nigerian heritage, but I do also make it clear that I wasn't born in Ireland, I didn't grow up in Ireland, I wasn't born in Nigeria, I didn't grow up in Nigeria. But I have had these influences now, and fortunately, although it took time, I know both sides of my heritage, and I'm extremely comfortable with that. And that being comfortable has given me much more confidence in who I am, and I'm really so at ease with my identity, and I'm very content with it.
Dame Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming on today and for chatting with us. I'm sure there's going to be a million questions that people have for you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Grace.
Thank you for tuning in to Irish Roots. Irish Roots is a completely volunteer-led festival. If you can donate, please do. For more information and to see what else is happening, jump over to our website. It's www.iamirish.org. From all of us at I Am Irish, Gurav Mila Mahagut.